Crystall Ball, predictions about bankruptcy mediations, part of the series Bankruptcy Mediations with Sylvia Mayer. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by instantmediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcast. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact dependent. Hi, everyone. This is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney, mediator, arbitrator, working throughout Florida and Texas.
And Natalia Łowska-Czajka, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland.
Hi, everybody. This is Sylvia Mayer. I'm an arbitrator, mediator, and attorney located in Houston, Texas. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Sylvia. Good to have you again. And this is another exciting conversation on bankruptcy mediations. And so it's always a interesting thing to have Sylvia because she tries to simplify something that can be very complicated for a lot of people, especially people who only find themselves dealing with this kind of stuff when they're, in bankruptcy court. But Sylvia is a peacemaker at heart. So she's always trying to bring together these complicated things and help parties settle their disputes outside of court without having to go through full litigation. So today's topic is we're delving into the future, right? We're trying to have Sylvia look into her crystal ball to look into the future about what bankruptcy mediation is going to look like in 2022. And so now everything we're going to talk about today is going to be basically speculation, right? Sylvia doesn't really know the future. Okay, just FYI. But she has enough experience you can draw back on to be able to, conclude some uh, theories and make some conclusions that may happen. And so we'd like for her to kind of first explain a little bit more, Sylvia, about bankruptcy mediation generally, because you've done that before in other talks that each has focused on some other subject. But before we get into your speculations or what you think is going to happen in the future about bankruptcy mediation, can you give the audience, especially people who are new to you, a broad overview of bankruptcy mediation and how it works?
Absolutely. Happy to do that. So bankruptcy mediation comes up in two broad categories: consumer and commercial, meaning businesses. And then within those categories, you will see bankruptcy mediations come up in the context of any types of disputes that may occur in the consumer or commercial cases. So in both cases, you will have claims disputes. One party says, you owe me money. The company or person in bankruptcy says, no, I don't. That could potentially become a mediation. Adversary proceedings, those are lawsuits that are filed in a bankruptcy case, either consumer or commercial. An area that you see primarily in consumer bankruptcy cases are fights over discharge. A consumer files bankruptcy, they want to be discharged from their liabilities after they come out of bankruptcy, and someone is arguing, my debt, what you owe me, cannot be discharged. On the commercial side, often those cases are Chapter 11 cases, which can be reorganizations. And in those cases, sometimes you will have fights about what's the Chapter 11 plan going to look like? What does the financing look like that helps the company operate in bankruptcy? How will the company use cash in the bankruptcy? Contract disputes that may either have arisen prior to the bankruptcy or during the bankruptcy. There's lots of different places this come up. And then again, both on the consumer and the commercial side, you can have avoidance action, litigation, which means opportunity for mediation. And avoidance actions are when the debtor, or in an instance where there's a trustee, sues somebody and says, you have something that you have to give back to the debtor for us to use that value to pay the other creditors. And so there's lots of different ways that it comes up in bankruptcy, and there's certainly differences between consumer and commercial. And in terms of whether there will be more or less opportunities in 2022, there are pressure points that are common to consumer and commercial and some that are different.
And having said that, and setting up this field for bankruptcy mediation in general, can you please go into a little bit more detail? What do you envisage in 2022 again, being just prophecy telling, because of that nobody can be sure what can really happen. But again, you being the expert, you know a lot of trends that are now happening, and I think that it's also about making people aware which direction things are going.
Absolutely. Happy to. Well, so let me look into my crystal ball here. Just kidding. So one thing that is a technical thing that may drive some bankruptcy mediations and litigation over the course of 2022 is avoidance actions, what I just referenced a few minutes ago, have a 2-year statute of limitations. So that means that bankruptcies that have been filed in the last 1 to 2 years, if they want to pursue an avoidance action, those lawsuits are going to get filed soon. And some of those lawsuits will go to mediation either automatically, because there are some jurisdictions around the country that automatically send all avoidance actions to mediation, and some will go voluntarily. So that's one bucket where I do think we probably will see some bump in bankruptcy mediation opportunities. Then you have to sort of step back from that and look at what are drivers for what causes an increase in consumer bankruptcy filing or an increase in commercial bankruptcy filing. And so let me share a couple of statistics with you, because I think this is helpful information when you're thinking about what the opportunities are looking ahead. And I apologize, I'm going to be reading this off of a piece of paper so that I make sure I get all the numbers right.
Yeah.
In 2021, so last year, 12,461 Chapter 7 bankruptcies, which are largely consumer, were filed in Texas. Some may be business, but they're largely consumer bankruptcies. And I just picked Texas as it's the state I live in, so I picked that as the example. Contrast that with the number of Chapter 7 filings in 2020 and 2019. In 2020, it was 15,474. And in 2019, it was 17,387. So we saw a decline. 2019 was here, 2020, 2021. We've seen a decline in Chapter 7 bankruptcies. Chapter 11 bankruptcies went sort of a little bit in the different direction. In 2019, commercial bankruptcies, Chapter 11 bankruptcies, there were 773 filings in Texas. In 2020, that went up to 1,841 filings in Texas. But then in 2021, it dropped down to 828 filings in Texas. And so, first of all, I don't have a grand master fix to explain to you why these things happen, but there's a couple of things you have to think about. Commercial bankruptcy filings tend to be driven by market cycles and industry cycles. So we saw a lot of oil and gas bankruptcies. We saw some retail bankruptcies because of external market forces, right, on the commercial side. On the consumer side, you saw a steep decline in filings because everybody at first thought when COVID came, oh my God, there's going to be so many consumer bankruptcy filings. But there was so much federal aid and state aid that went to support consumers, which was needed, that it allowed people to continue on. So there are some people who are predicting there will be a sharp increase in consumer bankruptcy filings over the next 12 months. So from around now until sometime next year, because all of that aid has fallen away. And now we're going to see the people who were able to get back on their feet won't need a bankruptcy filing, and those who have not been able to get back on their feet will need. Now, there's another interesting factor on the consumer side. 1 in 10 Americans owe medical debt. 1 in 10. That is an astronomical statistic. And what is really fascinating about this is that the credit rating agencies, I'm assuming in response to the fact that it is so prevalent, have recently announced that they are no longer going to report defaults or medical debt on credit reporting.
Heard that recently.
What does that mean for consumer bankruptcy filings? I don't know, because people still owe the money, but it's not going to show up on their credit reports. And so that'll have different factors. If it's not showing up in their credit report, then they may have more access to money so that they can pay or borrow or get credit and stay out of bankruptcy. But as their medical debt mounts, and oftentimes the reason you're incurring all of this medical debt is because you can't work, and then they're going to have the need for a bankruptcy filing. So if I were to make a prediction, I would anticipate that I think by year end, we'll see an increase in consumer bankruptcy filings. And I think you also have to think on the commercial side about the difference between big commercial bankruptcy cases and small commercial bankruptcy cases. So here's another statistic. Nearly,
Sylvia, Sylvia,
yes.
could you pause for a second? I know now you're about to switch on the commercial side, but backtracking to the consumer side, your prediction is that there's going to be an increase in consumer bankruptcy filings, and but do you think that that's just based on the fact that there was help from the federal government, okay, that helped consumers kind of make it through COVID, and now that that help has stopped, and because there's evictions and the medical thing, I mean, I didn't know that that's kind of a wrench that's thrown into that. Is that why you're saying that you think there's going to be the consumer bankruptcy filing increase, or are there any other reasons?
That is a great question. So here's why I think there will be an increase in consumer bankruptcy filings. One, all of the aid, or the vast majority of the aid, has rolled off. It's no longer there. Two, there's this tremendous weight of the medical debt. Three, interest rates are going up. When interest rates go up, that constricts access to credit. For businesses, access to capital, but for consumers, it's access to credit. If they want to borrow money, if they use a credit card, those kinds of things go up. Four, because we are in what people refer to as a post-pandemic phase, whether you agree or disagree with that in terms of the market, we are in a post-pandemic phase. A lot of the restraint that lenders were exercising in not pursuing going after collections actions, that's gone away. Same thing, you referred to evictions, same thing there. Before, there was a lot of landlords who were holding back on evictions, and whether because they were required to or they chose to, but now they're going forward. So I think we're going to see a much more aggressive pursuit of recovery on consumer debt, and that will then drive consumer bankruptcies.
Thank you. Yeah, you can continue commercial unless Natalia wanted to interject real quick. You still got there?
All right. So in terms of commercial, here's an interesting statistic. Nearly 40% of small businesses in the US intend to raise their prices by 10% or more in 2022. So that feeds not just the commercial bankruptcy side, but also the consumer bankruptcy side. It's yet another pressure on the consumers because you have inflation, but you're also going to have price increases. But it also puts pressure on the commercial side because at some point consumers can't continue to bear this cost increase. And so what you'll have is those small businesses that survived the pandemic, which was very hard on small businesses. We had a lot of small business failures, many of which didn't even go through bankruptcy. They just shuttered. But you'll have a lot of small businesses that managed to survive, and now in order to continue to survive, have to raise their prices, but their customers won't pay for it. Or they raise their prices, but they pass that price increase on to another business. So they may be a B2B business, which means business to business. They don't market or sell to consumers. They market or sell to other businesses. And so their price increase affects another business. and that causes a trickle-down effect. Here's another interesting statistic. 65% of loan professionals believe that bankruptcy filings will increase in 2022. That's not their focus is not on consumers. That's both consumer and commercial. And the factors that they're really focused on are inflation, price increases, and what I referred to a few minutes ago, this sort of post-pandemic, gloves are off now. We're going after recoveries. And so it will be really interesting to see how this plays out. In 2021, on the commercial side, only 8 public companies with more than $300 million in assets filed for bankruptcy. And that the last year that we had so few big bankruptcy filings was in 1987. And why do I raise that here in the context of talking about bankruptcy mediations? A lot of times it is the big cases, the biggest of the bankruptcy cases, that generate a tremendous amount of bankruptcy mediation opportunities. So remember, we talked about at the beginning, where do bankruptcy mediation opportunities lie? The vast majority of them involve claims litigation, discharge litigation, and avoidance action litigation. Sometimes you have some of these other things, negotiating plan terms, access to capital, financing, cash collateral, those kind of things. But the 3 biggest areas are discharge, claims, and avoidance actions. And it is the biggest cases that generate the most in terms of avoidance action, mediations, and litigation. And so that ties back to the comment I made previously about for bankruptcies that were filed in the last 2 years, they are coming up against a statute of limitations because there's a 2-year statute of limitations. And so there may be a bunch of adversary proceedings that are about to be filed, triggering avoidance actions, which then creates opportunities for bankruptcy mediation.
Is before I give Natalia the floor, I am sharing my screen. If you're listening to this, definitely tune into the YouTube version so you can see the screen share. I've showed the different statistics that Sylvia was going through, most of them anyway, just because I think this is very important. These are some of the drivers, right, that help to explain the predictions of what might happen. I think especially the inflation talk, that really I think is the key. When if I think you said nearly 40% of small businesses in the U.S. intend to raise prices by 10% or more in 2022, people can't sustain that for too long. Right, like I'm in the market for a new car, and like I was telling you off stage earlier on, and I can't believe the prices for new vehicles in the marketplace these days. Well, I can afford it, great. But for the people who actually, have car payments or who need to get into a new vehicle and or they can't afford gas, I mean, that's going to have the trickle down effects and unintended consequences that nobody ever, wanted. That, yes, I agree with you, will fuel bankruptcies being filed soon enough. Natalia, please.
Yes, so I wanted to also point out from the previous conversation with Sylvia and the remarks she's been passing on to us about the geographical interesting how geographically was then divided, saying that geographically the states that really handle these cases are Delaware, Southern District of New York, and Southern District of Texas. But isn't it in line with where the seats of the biggest financial institutions are, like insurance companies and banks, statistically within the United States?
So in 2021, 2/3 of the largest Chapter 11 cases were filed in the 3 jurisdictions you identified, Delaware, New York, and Texas. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So yes, a driver for that is the location of the financial institutions, the primary investors. Many of those are located in New York. In addition, There were a lot of energy related bankruptcy filings. And here I live in Houston, where we consider ourselves to be the energy capital of the world.
Mhm.
And so that's a factor why Houston is a place where so many big cases are filed. And so many companies are incorporated in Delaware. And place of incorporation is a basis for selecting your venue for the bankruptcy filing. There's another layer to this, which is the Southern District of New York, the Southern District of Texas, and the Delaware bankruptcy courts have very developed procedures and guidelines and rules and a deep bench of experience dealing with complex Chapter 11 cases. And so they tend to be the jurisdictions that the parties who are making the decision of where to file in a big case would prefer to go because they like certainty. They like knowing the judges that they're going to be in front of. And so, as a general rule, when you're trying to decide where to file bankruptcy, the parties who have the seat at the table to try and figure that out tend to be the company that's filing bankruptcy, whoever they've selected to be their lender in the bankruptcy, which we refer to as a DIP lender, and their primary pre-bankruptcy creditors, which may actually be the same party that's the DIP lender, but could be others. There may be a bondholder group that they've been in conversations with. There's other people who may have a seat at the table when they're making that decision. And so there's a lot of variables that go into it, but it's helpful to know where those big cases are filed because that shows you where there may be opportunities for bankruptcy mediation. And let me just share with you one other interesting tidbit that I just read yesterday that I think is going to have an impact on commercial bankruptcy opportunities in 2022 and beyond. In the first quarter of 2022, institutional investors have invested almost $20 billion, 19.8 billion with a B, into hedge funds. And that means that there is a lot of access to capital out there, but hedge funds tend to be aggressive investors. Why are institutional investors in putting all of this money into hedge funds? Most likely in response to volatility in the marketplace, inflation, rising interest rates, what's going on in Ukraine, the impacts on consumers as a result of all of these factors. All of those things go into the equation to create a very volatile marketplace, which creates opportunities for hedge funds. But in terms of the world of bankruptcy, when hedge funds are flush with cash, that means that companies have greater access to capital, maybe expensive capital. It may be what we call loan to own capital, where they're investing money with the idea that maybe one day they can convert the money they invested into ownership of the company. But it tends to reduce the amount of filings for a commercial bankruptcy. When there's a lot of access to capital, there are fewer companies have to file because they can find a band-aid. They can find somebody to keep them out. But at some point, that always comes back to roost. And so it'll be interesting to see how these competing pressures play out over the next 12 to 24 months. I have heard from several people in the restructuring world on the commercial side that they came into this year anticipating that there was going to be an increase in bankruptcy filings. But because there has been this recent flood of money into the part of the market that can keep companies out of bankruptcy, now they're starting to think, well, maybe there'll actually be an increase in out of court workouts where we negotiate these kinds of deals outside of bankruptcy and fewer actual bankruptcy filings. And we'll really see. We'll see how it
Yeah.
all plays out.
Well, months from now, I'd like for us to revisit this and see how well your predictions were. So I think the conclusion for today is that on the consumer side, we'll probably see an increase in um, bankruptcies and bankruptcy filings, mostly Chapter sevens. I'm guessing 13s as well. And I think those are easier maybe for people to understand because they're kitchen table issues. Inflation is one of them, and gas prices and rent and evictions. I mean, these things are more tangible anyways. Some of the other type of bankruptcies, when you go into the commercial side, I mean, Chapter 11s, yeah, that one I don't know. So what's your last word on it?
So my prediction for Chapter 11s is that there probably were a lot of companies that were in the pipeline, meaning they were prepping for a bankruptcy filing and or already engaged in restructuring negotiations, but now they're having an increased access to capital, and so we'll see a lull. But I think that with rising interest rates and the pressures of inflation and the pressures on consumers, I'm speculating that by the end of the year or next year, we will see a sharp increase in commercial-oriented bankruptcy filings. And I think the industries to watch for that are retail and healthcare. I think healthcare is an interesting area to be watching for potential restructurings. What happens in the energy sector in terms of pricing will also be fascinating because right now, a lot of energy companies that may have been struggling, may have been on the brink, now with the rising prices, it's lifted them out of their crisis. And if prices were to fall, they'll be right back into the thick of it, but at a point where there's inflation and higher interest rates. So that could be an interesting dynamic that changes. So if I have to state it in one sentence, I'd say, I think over the course of this year, filings will go up for consumers and stay flat for commercial. But mediation opportunities in bankruptcy, I think, will probably stay relatively flat in the consumer world. And there will be an uptick on the commercial side because of the statute of limitations running on avoidance actions. The reason I think it's going to stay flat on the consumer side is I don't think that the consumer bankruptcy filings that are coming are going to be bankruptcy filings that will drive a lot of avoidance actions and or discharge litigation, because discharge litigation generally comes up when there's issues around fraud. And I think a lot of these are going to be more around these types of consumer purchasing power issues we've talked about: medical debt, inflation, eviction, those types of things. So those are my predictions, and we'll see how it comes out.
And
Yes, like
with that, we really would want to thank you so much, Sylvia. And really, as Max said, that would be great to have a revisit of all of that, see how much of a fortune teller you are. I do believe that the main idea we need to take it all is that mediation in bankruptcy is going to grow. And there is always good opportunities, both for consumers and businesses and mediators. And also, the areas where the geographically intensive, the biggest cases are handled, will also be staffed with the best professionals who can handle these cases. If there are any other areas within the US that can say differently, I'll be very happy to hear from people about it and challenge that.
all right, everybody. Until next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.